Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the most famous and really infamous events in human history, the sinking of the RMS Titanic. For over a century now, this tragedy has been framed almost entirely as a story of terrible, unavoidable bad luck. Just a rogue iceberg sneaking up in the dark, right? But when you actually look closely at the historical record, a totally different picture emerges. We're going to see that this disaster was absolutely not just a stroke of bad luck. It was a terrifying chronological cascade of mechanical flaws and human errors. Okay, let's dive right into this. 12 square feet. That is roughly the size of a standard closet door. Think about that for a second. Out of a massive vessel that was nearly 900 feet long and weighed tens of thousands of tons, it literally only took about 12 square feet of actual damage to sink the largest, most advanced ship in the world. How is that even mathematically possible? Well, to understand that, we first have to understand exactly what was floating out there on the water. Section 1. The world's largest ship, a monument to hubris. When the Titanic departed on April 10, 1912, it wasn't just a ship, it was a floating palace. It was a complete testament to human engineering and, honestly, ultimate ambition. The sheer scale of this thing was just mind-boggling. We're talking about reciprocating engines that stood 40 feet tall. To keep those massive engines moving, you had stokers down below shoveling 600 tons of coal into the furnaces every single day. And the wealth on board? A single first-class parlor suite for a one-way ticket cost the equivalent of $145,000 today. No way, right? There were over 2,200 passengers and crew on board, but here is the absolute critical detail you need to keep in mind. Despite this massive scale, the vast majority of the crew were engineers, firemen, and galley staff waiting hand and foot on the wealthy passengers. They were not highly trained sailors. Section 2. Into Iceberg Alley. Ignored warnings. Let's move forward to April 14th, which is 4 days into the voyage. The weather had shifted. It was this crystal clear, exceptionally calm, but moonless night. The Titanic was steaming directly toward disaster, but the thing is, they were not flying blind. On April 14th alone, they received an absolute barrage of incoming wireless radio warnings. At 9:12 a.m., they got reports of bergs and field ice. By 1:49 p.m., a nearby ship reported passing 2 large icebergs. At 7:37 p.m., another warning comes in. And at 10:07 p.m., the nearby SS Californian explicitly warned that they were stopped and totally surrounded by ice. In total, the Titanic received 7 distinct messages about sea ice, yet, incredibly, they maintained a reckless, full speed of roughly 22 knots. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth would they ignore these warnings? It wasn't madness. Shockingly enough, it was just standard maritime practice of the time. Ships treated ice warnings as casual advisories, not hard reasons to slow down. Transatlantic liners prized timekeeping above everything else because they had to stick to their advertised schedules. And there was just this absolute arrogance in the engineering of the era. Just 5 years prior in 1907, Captain Edward Smith himself stated that he could not imagine any condition that would cause a ship to founder. He literally said, modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that. Section 3, the glancing blow, 2340, ship's time. And that brings us to the fateful moment. The water that night was described by survivors as being like glass. Without any rough water to break against the base of the icebergs, they were nearly invisible in the moonless dark until it was entirely too late. At 23:39, panic strikes the crow's nest. Lookout Frederick Fleet spots this dark mass looming in their path. He rings the bell 3 times and makes his famous, terrifying call to the bridge. Iceberg, right ahead. First Officer William Murdoch attempts what's known as a port-around maneuver. Basically, he's trying to swing the bow away and then immediately swing the stern clear to avoid the ice entirely. But the massive ship is just moving way too fast. They avoid a head-on collision, sure, but they suffer a scraping, glancing blow along the starboard side that lasts for about 6 agonizing seconds. Now, what's really interesting here is busting a long-held myth. For decades, the story was that the iceberg tore this massive, continuous 300-foot gash into the side of the hull. But modern ultrasound surveys of the wreck have proven that's entirely false. The actual damage consisted of just 6 narrow punctures running in a line. The most destructive of those gashes were only about the size of a couple of sheets of standard printer paper. When you total it all up, like we said earlier, just 12 square feet of ocean exposure. So how in the world did these tiny punctures happen? Well, the answer actually lies in metallurgy. The plates in the bow of the ship were held together by what were called number 3 wrought iron rivets. These specific rivets contained really high levels of impurities known as slag inclusions. In the freezing, extreme cold of the North Atlantic, these iron rivets became incredibly brittle. When the immense weight of the ship scraped against the iceberg, the rivets didn't bend under the pressure, they snapped like glass. That popped open the seams between the massive steel plates just enough to let the ocean inside.
Section 4. The engineering failure, mathematical certainty.
Once those brittle seams popped, the ship's fate was sealed by brutal, undeniable math. Freezing ocean water began pouring into the hull at an estimated rate of 7 tons per second. To put that into perspective, that rate of flooding was 15 times faster than the ship's internal pumps could possibly handle. From the very first moments after the impact, the pumps were just utterly defeated. But wait, didn't the Titanic have state-of-the-art watertight compartments? Well, yes, it did, but they harbored a massive, fatal design flaw. The ship could technically survive with up to 4 forward compartments flooded, but the iceberg compromised the first 6. As the water rapidly filled the front of the ship, that immense weight pulled the ship's bow deeper and deeper into the ocean. Because those watertight bulkheads were not sealed at the top, they didn't go all the way up to the ceiling, the water simply rose and spilled over the top into the next compartment. It's exactly like water spilling across an ice cube tray. Once that started, it was a mathematical certainty. The ship was going down. Section 5. A flawed evacuation. 005 ship's time. So Captain Smith and the ship's builder Thomas Andrews quickly inspect the damage. Within minutes, Andrews delivers the horrific news. The ship has at most 2 hours to live. At 12:05 a.m., Captain Smith orders the lifeboats uncovered. He is fully aware that over 1,000 people are about to die. So the crucial point here is the terrifying math of the lifeboats. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats with a total capacity of 1,178 people. But remember, there were over 2,200 souls on board. Believe it or not, by the standards of the day, this was actually legally adequate. Lifeboats were meant to just ferry passengers back and forth to a rescue ship. They weren't designed to hold everyone at once. But sitting in the middle of the freezing ocean, with help hours away, it was a terrifying, functionally disastrous reality. Literally, half the ship had no seat. But the tragedy really compounds when you see how these lifeboats were actually launched. Boat 7 left with 28 people instead of 65. Boat 6, the exact same. Boat 1 had a capacity of 40 and left with just 12 people aboard. Why on earth did that happen? Well, it was a complete lack of crew training. The only lifeboat drill scheduled for that Sunday had been canceled. There were almost no trained seamen on board who knew how to row the boats, and total confusion over the women and children first order meant officers were launching boats half empty rather than letting men fill the vacant seats. As the grim reality set in, we see these profound, deeply human moments anchoring all these overwhelming statistics. Ida Strauss, the wife of Macy's co-owner Isidore Strauss, completely refused to get into a lifeboat without her husband. She famously told him, "We have been living together for many years. Where you go, I go." They simply sat down in a pair of deck chairs on the sinking ship and chose to face their end together. While the wealthy passengers were making these incredibly tragic choices up on the upper decks, a total logistical nightmare was unfolding down below. For starters, there was no public address system to wake people up. But the most horrific systemic failure fell upon the third-class passengers. Many of them were trapped in this absolute maze of lower decks. Required by U.S. immigration law to be segregated, the gates separating steerage from the rest of the ship were literally locked, and in some cases, actively guarded by crewmen. When you combine that with severe language barriers for immigrants who didn't speak a word of English, the third-class passengers were overwhelmingly doomed right from the very start. Section 6. The Final Moments. 01:45 ship's time. As we push past 1:30 a.m., the angle of the deck grows incredibly steep. The freezing water is pouring in, and the ship's electrical systems are fighting a desperately losing battle against the ocean. In the radio room, operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride are frantically tapping out the new SOS and the standard CQD distress signals. But below decks, this immense, unseen heroism is taking place. The ship's engineers and volunteers are fighting in the absolute bowels of the ship, keeping the generators running just to maintain the lights and the radio power. They sacrificed themselves, staying behind to ensure those final frantic signals got out, knowing full well they had absolutely no chance of escape. And this brilliantly illustrates the tragic irony of those distress calls. The RMS Carpathia did answer the call, but they were 93 kilometers, or about 4 hours away. Meanwhile, the SS Californian was just 10 to 19 kilometers away. They were literally in visual range of the Titanic's distress rockets, but Their sole radio operator had gone to sleep at 11:30 p.m. The closest ship, the one that absolutely could have saved hundreds of lives, simply didn't know what was happening until it was entirely too late. Which leaves us here. The sinking of the Titanic is basically the ultimate historical example of the Swiss cheese model of disaster. It wasn't one massive failure, it was the exact catastrophic alignment of brittle iron, ignored warnings, canceled drills, unchecked hubris, and one sleeping radio operator. So if the deadliest maritime disaster of its time was essentially just a cascade of small systemic errors, what modern systems today are currently relying on that exact same fragile luck? Think about that next time you assume the technology we rely on every day is truly unsinkable. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time.